The first shot doesn't come from the defenders, it comes from the men, who should still be on the other side of the river by the time the sound reaches the defensive line. Several figures have already crossed the ice and taken position, their rifles steady despite the cold, their aim precise. The defenders hesitate for half a second, just enough, and then the second shot lands, followed by another and another, as bodies drop behind sandbags that were never meant to face this direction. Out on the river, the rest of the force is still moving, a long fractured line of soldiers spread across the frozen surface, each step measured, each movement deliberate, the ice groaning beneath them, low and unstable, but never quite breaking. They can see the fight already unfolding ahead, flashes of gunfire cutting through the pale daylight, and they know exactly what waits if they make it across and what happens if they don't. From the defensive side, the scene doesn't make sense at first, shapes shifting through a thin layer of mist that distorts distance and scale, light reflecting off the ice and turning movement into something unreal, something easy to misread. It doesn't look like an attack until it is, and by the time that realization fully settles in, by the time the defenders understand what they are actually seeing, the battle has already begun. If you're into stories where every decision has a cost, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments, would you risk crossing that ice knowing it might not hold? The stronghold sits behind a frozen river that has always been treated as a natural barrier, something that slows movement, limits options, and buys time. Defensive lines face inland routes, supply pots, and elevated ground, where an organized assault would normally come from. The river, wide and exposed, was monitored but not feared. Patrols were lighter here, observation less aggressive, because no rational force would choose to advance across unstable ice under open daylight. But this attack isn't built on caution, it's built on expectation. The attackers understand the psychology of the defense just as much as its physical layout, and they know that hesitation is more valuable than surprise. They don't need everyone to make it across, just enough to break the line at the wrong moment. And as the first shots echo across the frozen surface, that moment is already slipping away. 1947. They don't rush across the frozen river, because speed here is more dangerous than hesitation. The attackers move in a stretched formation, each soldier keeping distance from the next to reduce pressure on the ice beneath them. Every step is deliberate, tested before full weight is applied, as if the ground itself has to grant permission. Rifles are carried low, not yet ready for engagement, but positioned for quick reaction if needed. No one speaks. Communication is reduced to gestures and brief glances, because sound carries too far in the cold. The entire movement feels unnatural, slow in a way that contradicts the urgency of combat. But this isn't a normal battlefield, and they are not fighting only an enemy. The ice beneath them is unpredictable, and every meter forward is earned through control, not speed. The daylight stretches across the river, creating a deceptive clarity that hides more than it reveals. A thin layer of mist drifts just above the ice, softening outlines and breaking shapes into fragments that shift with the wind. Light reflects off the frozen surface in uneven patterns, flattening depth and distorting distance in a way that confuses the eye. What appears far can be close, and what seems small can be far larger than expected. From a distance, the advancing soldiers don't resemble a coordinated force. They look scattered, disconnected, almost incidental to the landscape. This visual distortion is not planned, but it becomes an advantage. It delays recognition, and in a situation like this, delay is more valuable than invisibility. On the defensive side, the river is under observation, but not under pressure. The assumption that no organized force would attempt a crossing here shapes how attention is distributed. Observers report movement, but the information lacks urgency. Some interpret it as minor patrol activity, while others attribute it to visual distortion caused by light and mist. There is no immediate escalation, no rapid shift in posture, because nothing aligns with the expectation of a real attack. This is not negligence, but reliance on probability. The river has always been a barrier, and that belief remains intact just long enough to create a gap between perception and reality. That gap becomes the attacker's opportunity. The first group reaches the far edge of the river without triggering a full defensive response, and they do not hesitate once they step onto solid ground. They move quickly into position, using whatever cover is available, and begin firing almost immediately. Their targets are not random. They focus on exposed angles and blind spots in the defensive layout, areas that were never meant to face direct assault. The initial shots land with precision, not because of superior marksmanship, but because of timing. The defenders are caught mid-adjustment, forced to react to a threat that should not exist in that direction. The sound of gunfire spreads across the position, breaking whatever uncertainty remained. The impact is immediate and disorienting for the defenders, who are forced to reorient under pressure. Weapons are turned, positions are shifted, and commands are issued in overlapping sequences that struggle to establish control. Some soldiers respond quickly, adapting their aim and finding cover, while others are caught in exposed positions during the transition. The first casualties occur within seconds, not due to lack of skill, but due to the direction of the attack. Defensive structures, carefully built to face expected threats, now offer limited protection. The line does not collapse, but it bends under the sudden shift, and that moment of instability creates space for the attackers already on land to maintain pressure. Behind the first wave, the majority of the attacking force is still on the ice, continuing the crossing under increasing tension. They can see the engagement ahead, flashes of gunfire reflecting off the frozen surface, and they can hear the exchange clearly in the open environment. The situation ahead confirms that the plan is working, but it also removes any possibility of retreat. The river behind them is just as dangerous as the one beneath them, and turning back would expose them to the same risks without purpose. Each soldier continues forward, aware that the battle has already begun without them. Their role now is to reinforce success before it fades. The formation begins to lose its initial consistency as pressure builds across the line. The front is engaged, the middle pushes forward to close distance, and the rear hesitates at sections, where the ice sounds thinner underfoot. Small variations in movement create uneven spacing, and the once controlled progression becomes slightly fragmented. No one breaks formation completely, but the rhythm is no longer uniform. The sound of the ice shifts in tone as weight redistributes, producing low cracks that travel beneath the surface. These signals are noticed, but not acted upon. Momentum has taken priority, and stopping now would create more risk than continuing forward. On land, the defenders begin to stabilize their response, returning fire with more coordination and forcing the first wave of attackers into partial cover. The immediate shock starts to fade, replaced by controlled reaction and localized command. However, something about the engagement feels incomplete. The volume of fire and the number of visible attackers do not match the scale of a full assault. There is a disconnect between what is being faced and what should be expected. As that realization forms, attention begins to shift back toward the river. The true scale of the attack is still unfolding, and most of it is not yet on solid ground. The defenders realize too late that the battle is not where they are looking, but where they are not firing. The first wave on land is real and dangerous, already inside their perimeter, while the rest of the attacking force is still stretched across the frozen river and unstable, segments moving under a surface already showing visible structural stress. For a brief moment there is hesitation within the defensive line, not from fear but from rapid reassessment, as fragmented reports and direct observation begin to conflict with the expectation that the river would function only as a delay. That contradiction creates a short but critical pause in coordination, because in that pause the battlefield exists into separate realities at once. Immediate close-range combat on land, and a developing crossing that is still unfolding behind it. The correction spreads across positions as the river is reinterpreted from background terrain into the central axis of the attack. Defensive logic shifts under pressure from direct engagement to structural disruption, because eliminating the first group is no longer enough if additional forces continue to arrive. Fire begins to redirect toward the ice itself, with aim adjusted away from visible targets and concentrated on weakened sections of the frozen surface. The impacts do not create immediate collapse, but they compromise internal stability, spreading fractures beneath the surface that are not fully visible, but are detected through vibration and sound. The attackers notice the change as movement becomes less stable and the rhythm of the crossing begins to break. As pressure continues, the formation on the river loses cohesion, and movement becomes fragmented as soldiers adjust individually to unstable ground. Spacing increases, coordination weakens, and the crossing turns into disconnected movement rather than a unified advance. The ice no longer functions as a consistent platform but as a shifting network of variable stability, where some sections hold and others fail without warning. The first collapses occur in isolated zones where structural limits are exceeded, removing support instantly and breaking continuity across the formation. Those still advancing are forced to slow or reroute, and the original structure of the assault begins to dissolve in real time. At the same time, the defenders complete the elimination of all attackers who had not yet reached land. The remaining forces on the river are either cut off by collapse, or enabled to maintain progression as the crossing fails under sustained pressure. This removes any possibility of reinforcement, isolating the battlefield to those already engaged on solid ground. However, the attackers who successfully crossed have already established positions inside the defensive perimeter and continue fighting with intensity, inflicting significant casualties and forcing rapid adjustments across the line. With the river no longer functioning as a route of reinforcement, the engagement becomes entirely land-based. The defenders begin to stabilize their response through improved coordination, use of cover, and structured firing lines, while the attackers maintain pressure in close-range combat despite isolation. The intensity increases in confined space, where positioning and timing decide survival more than numbers, and every movement carries immediate consequence. The battlefield is now fractured, and control depends entirely on whether the defenders can contain what has already crossed before it expands further. The attackers who cross the river are no longer part of a unified force. They are separated from the ice behind them, cut off from reinforcement, and forced into a fight that has lost its structure and direction. Yet they continue pushing forward, trying to turn early momentum into a breakthrough inside the defensive perimeter. Every position they take triggers immediate response, and every exchange of fire compresses the battlefield further into isolated pockets of close combat. What was once a coordinated assault has become fragmented survival inside hostile ground. The defenders are no longer reacting blindly. The moment the river crossing collapsed, the entire shape of the battle changed. With no additional forces arriving, the attackers on land are reduced to isolated groups rather than a continuous offensive. Defensive units tighten their formation under pressure, reinforce key positions, in close gaps that were exposed in the opening phase. Communication stabilizes, control improves, and the engagement shifts from disruption to containment. The fight is still violent and close, but it is no longer expanding or evolving in favor of the attackers. Behind them, the frozen river is effectively removed from the conflict. The ice continues to fracture in scattered sections, but there is no organized movement left across it. What remains is disintegration, abandoned spacing, failed progression, and isolated soldiers cut off before reaching the fight. The defenders no longer need to allocate attention to that axis. The river has already done its role in deciding the outcome, not as a path of advance, but as the point where the attack lost its continuity. Inside the perimeter, the attackers attempt to compensate for their situation through aggression. They push into closer range, trying to break defensive structure through speed and pressure rather than coordination. For a short time, this creates localized instability, forcing some defensive positions to adjust and fall back slightly, but the defenders absorb the impact instead of collapsing under it. They reposition, stabilize firing lines, and force the attackers into increasingly confined areas where movement becomes restricted and predictable. The initial momentum of the assault is no longer present, only isolated resistance. The critical failure of the attackers becomes undeniable as the engagement progresses. They committed to the attack before securing full crossing strength. Assuming the river would continue functioning as a safe corridor behind them, that decision split. They're forced at the worst possible moment. Once the defenders redirected fire toward the ice, reinforcement collapsed entirely, and the attacking formation was permanently divided. Those on land were left unsupported, and those on the river were consumed by structural failure before ever joining the fight. From that point onward, the outcome stopped being uncertain. The battle is lost for the attackers, not in a single moment, but in the irreversible loss of coordination, reinforcement, and control over terrain. Inside the perimeter, they are isolated, contained, and gradually reduced under sustained defensive pressure. Their presence remains dangerous, but no longer decisive. The defenders no longer face an advancing army, only the remnants of one that failed to arrive together. When the final resistance fades and the firing slows, the conclusion is clear. The attackers did not simply fail to break the defense, they lost the battle. The moment their force was divided across the river. Nothing about this victory was clean or easy. The defenders were hit hard, forced into emergency reaction under conditions they did not expect, and they paid for every mistake in blood and time. But once the river crossing failed and the attackers were split, the balance shifted. What followed was not dominance, but endurance, holding the line long enough for structure to return and for the assault to collapse under its own fragmentation. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment what you think decided this battle: the crossing itself, or the defenders adapting in time to stop it.